Let prayers be said.
O Lord, our God, who art the lover of justice and truth, give thy grace to our Parliament and to all who direct the affairs of our nation, and guide them by the Holy Spirit, we beseech thee, that by word and deed they may promote the well-being of this people and set forward peace among all people through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen. The Honourable, the Senate is now in session.
Messages from His Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honour.
We have notices of lateness for His Honour the President and for Senator Jonathan Reid.
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move the deferral of the minutes of our meeting held on Monday, the 23rd of March, 2026.
So moved. The question is that the minutes for the meeting held on Monday, March 23rd, 2026 be deferred. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Madam Deputy President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents: the loan agreement, polyclinic upgrade and refurbishment of the primary healthcare system project signed between the Saudi Fund for Development and the Government of Barbados. Convention 150, Labour Administration Convention of 1978, number 150, and Recommendation R158, Labour Administration Recommendation of 1978, number 158. Third, Convention 175, Part-Time Work Convention, 1994, number 175, and Recommendation 182, Part-Time Work Recommendation, 1994, number 182. And finally, the annual reports and audited financial statements of the Barbados Aviation and Aircraft Services Company Limited for the years ended March 31st, 2024 and March 31st, 2025.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Reports, I'll read that again. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions related to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by the minister.
Madam Deputy, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the rest of today's sitting. All those senators in favor, please say aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Introduction of bills.
Madam Deputy, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. The first reading of the State Acquisition and Vesting of Property Bill 2026, the first reading of the Older Persons Care and Protection Bill of 2026, and to also move the first reading of the Barbados Medical Products Bill 2026.
The question is that the State Acquisition and Vesting of Property Bill 2026, the Older Persons Care and Protection Bill 2026, and the Barbados Medical Products Bill 2026 be now read first time. All honourable senators. Senator Mallow.
Madam Deputy President, in the document circulated, I did not see the third bill that you read as on the agenda for today. I'm just inquiring as if it was. Thank you for the clarity.
The bill, thank you, Honourable Senator, for the question. The bill to which you refer is not on the agenda, but it is formally being read for the first time today, but will not be debated. I think I was in the process of putting the question. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Honourable senators against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Public business. Order number 2, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Older Persons Care and Protection Bill 2026.
Public business is now the order of the day. The Leader of Government Business, Honourable Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy President. I rise today to speak on the bill that we have just read for a first time, older persons in need. This bill would provide for older persons in need of care and protection and other related matters. Now, Madam Deputy, this bill was read and debated in the other place some time ago, and I know that as a consequence, honourable members would have had an opportunity to hear the debate and to hear the subsequent conversations around the older persons bill. Now, I want to start, as I usually do, by going through the actual bill itself and making sure that I have outlined the provisions of the bill that we will be speaking about as we continue the debate. The bill, Madam Deputy, is divided into 10 parts, and it has an appendix as a schedule. The first part of it is just a preliminary component, and I want to take the opportunity to welcome a number of persons who are here with us as visitors, and I take the opportunity to go through the bill for their benefit as well. I believe they're representing the Leadership Institute, is that correct? Yes? And so as young aspiring leaders, I also want to take the time to make sure that I'm able to share with you how legislative procedures are undertaken. So the bill begins, as I've just outlined in the preliminary section. Then it speaks about the administration of the provisions of the bill, assigned to an entity now called the Social Empowerment Agency previously would have been multiple agencies representing a range of interests, whether it was persons in the area of children, whether it was persons with the welfare services, whether it was the national assistance, whether it was persons responsible for looking after the elderly. All of those things have now been amalgamated into a single entity called the Social Empowerment Agency, and that is the agency that is charged with the administration of this piece of legislation. The role of the minister is outlined in Part 2, Section 6, but just to be clear, even though in legislation you will find the role of the minister, it isn't specific to the person of the minister, it refers to the office of the minister. And there are general principles there. Then there's service standards. I'll speak about that a little bit later on in my presentation. But the crux of this bill begins from Section 4 onwards, where we talk about the protection of older persons. And this section is important because for the first time, it defines what protection looks like. It also defines what safety looks like, but it also looks at the definitions of abuse. So you'll see that in Section 4 of the legislation. In Part 5, you have places of safety. What does that look like? And unlawful removal of a vulnerable adult from a place of safety. I'll speak about that in a minute. Part 6, residential facilities. What does a residential facility need to have as a minimum standard for the protection and care of an older person and to ensure their safety? And it's quite a lengthy section. It has clauses 18 through 32, and it talks about things like what is a classification of residential facilities, what are the rights of older persons in those facilities, what services are to be provided in residential facilities, and registration. This is an important part of it, which I will speak about a little later on as well. Establishment of residence committees for residential facilities, and then it goes on to things like inspection of those facilities, obstruction of inspectors and what they're allowed to do under the law. Then this is still Barbados, and we have a lot of families that keep their older family members at home, and their standards that are set for older persons' home-based care. Then, of course, it is still, this bill has the intersection of social care and medical services in the health sector. And so medical information is confidential. Let me say that again. Medical information is confidential to the patient or to any other person that they have authorized to act on their behalf. No one else can share a person's medical information. And so that is covered in this legislation, confidential. It allows for the restriction on the publication of any type. Once upon a time, publication in a different era referred to publication in books and papers. Now publication can mean anything, and in a young generation, it also means publication in spaces that you frequent, like social media. Enforcement, you have enforcement provisions. No good law is good law without an enforcement provision. It means that you have to be able to adhere to the law, otherwise there are penalties. And then there are a number of miscellaneous provisions in Part 10, which speak about things like providing false documentation statements, what the regulations are, and of course the commencement of that legislation. Then of course, and finally, the schedule, which speaks specifically to the classification of residential facilities, and it talks about what care and housing needs have to be met in this legislation. And so that, Madam Deputy President and members of the Senate, members of the public, is the substantive overview of the bill itself. Now I want to get into what the bill aims to do, why it was brought to Parliament, what it is expected to do as we proceed. Now, I want to connect this bill, Older Persons Bill, with a separate body of work that was also done by this government starting in 2018, the Population Commission, which was created, and the population census as well. And we've heard all of the conversations around how Barbados has an aging population. Barbados has a population that where our death rate is not in sync with our birth rate, meaning simply we're not having more children than we have persons there. We also have had a conversation on our social security system and the fact that persons are living longer, and Barbados has a life expectancy that oftentimes see people reaching their centenary years and just below that. That's a good thing in many ways, but what do we do with an aging population? How do we look after our people? And so in 2021, there was a population census. I'm going to start there. And it estimated that we have a population of around 269 odd thousand people and an average age of not 25, not 18, not 21, but 42 and a half. And this is actually up from 2010, when the average age for Barbados was 37.3. So we have a population that is mid-age, average, and older. And so that's the reality of the population overall, and that's where the starting point of this legislation will take us. The birth rate, which I mentioned, was in 2022, 8.48 per 1,000. And the death rate was 12.48 per the same 1,000. So the health report, which is published annually for Barbados, gave a fertility rate of 1.4 in 2020, and it had a negative natural increase. So in plain language, more persons are dying than are being born. And in policy language, the age of our population is shifting, and the care burden for those older persons is rising. So in parliamentary terms now, bringing a piece of legislation like this means that we are ensuring that we open up the space for policy decisions to be taken on behalf of that aging population. That's why this bill matters. You've heard me as Minister of Health in a different place on a different occasion speaking about older persons in many instances being abandoned in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. You've heard me and you've heard others talk about the number of persons who on any given day may come, present to the accident and emergency room, and they're not well on that day. They get admitted, they're being treated, and on the day that they are ready for discharge and they're ready to go home, there's no one coming to get them. You've heard me say that. You probably have not heard me say that in many cases, when the social workers call the family members of these persons, they will say to the social workers, no one is coming to get them. We're not coming to get them. And it's not that they're not coming to get them just because. Sometimes that may be true, but in other instances, the care of a person who is elderly, can you imagine if you are a single mother, you've got 3 kids, and you're at home and you have an elderly person who lives with you or who you live with, and they have some kind of medical illness or medical condition that even though they're well enough to be at home, they need continuous care. And you're not there to take care of them, and you don't have the means to provide for a residential care facility for them to go into. And so what do you do? In some instances, people describe it to us as being cruel to be kind, so that they feel as though, some of them have said to us, they feel as though the safest place for their relative is not at home alone, but it is in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. From our perspective, from a policy perspective, that's not the best place for them. Just earlier this week, I also had the opportunity to go through, as I continue to tour the Ministry of Health, which is vast in a lot of its spaces, to tour the psychiatric hospital. And the exact scenario that I described at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital exists in a psychiatric hospital. You have older persons who have equally been abandoned in the psychiatric hospital. But here's what caught my attention. I asked the nurses and the doctors there, do people come, do the family members come and visit them at least? Even if it is that you say you can't take them home because of A or B or C reason. Do you at least go and visit that older person, the builders of our nation, the person sometimes in whose house you live? No. the person who may have sent you to school, do they at least come and visit these persons? And the nurses and the doctors say to me, no. Save and except for one or two persons here or there, families aren't going to visit them. So I'm going to start my comments today by making an appeal to families. Oh gosh, no one is saying that they don't understand the challenges that you may be having, but these people are there, and the nurses and the doctors in an institution have become their family because you are not there. Abandonment, and this legislation speaks to it, is not even just a physical act. It is the emotional and the mental knowledge that your family is not checking for you in Bajan terms. They're not coming to provide you with the things that you like to eat, that they know you may like to eat. They're not coming to bring some snacks. And even if they don't have to buy anything, they're not even coming with time. 30 minutes, which could cost you nothing. So from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital to the psychiatric hospital, no family engagement. But it goes on. In our district hospitals, whether it is the St. Lucie District Hospital or the St. Philip District Hospital, Barbados has done the same thing. I asked the nurses and the doctors there the same question. They're there. Who comes to visit them? Anybody? And across the board, most times, without exception, whether it is in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital when they are abandoned there, or in the psychiatric hospital when they are abandoned there, whether it is the St. Lucie District Hospital or the St. Philip District Hospital, family members not only are leaving them there, but they're not coming back even to visit them there. There's something fundamentally wrong, Barbados, with that. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. These are our elders. These are our older persons. And so this is a piece of legislation that seeks to legislate against abuse and to protect our elderly, our older persons. But that does not change hearts or change minds. And there has to be a culture shift around how we treat to our elderly. More benign things, like if you're on a bus and you're young, strong, and vibrant, and an old person gets on the bus, an older person, and there are seats reserved for persons with disabilities, mothers with young babies, pregnant women, and yes, older persons. You got young and strong, able-bodied people that don't get up. They may sit there. Elderly persons who may have some kind of medical condition and reason why they may still be active, they may still be on their own, but you just go and park in a disabled parking spot or in a parking space that says for older persons, for our elders, because, oh, you're just running in quick and fast. But come on now, it takes nothing away from us. And so while this is a piece of legislation, the core of what needs to happen in this country is a shift in culture and how we protect and care for our elders. So that's where the bill attempts to create a framework, but there's a whole lot more that has to happen in our homes. Now, what do we have here? The first thing in the legislation it speaks about is that it affirms older persons as rights holders. That's one of the most important precepts outlined in this legislation. And it matters. It matters because the law begins not from incapacity, but from dignity. It gives you the dignity of being able to say you are a rights holder. And what are those rights? It means that age, your age, is not treated as a disqualification for respect. It ensures that you are able to have the benefit under the law of participation, respect, and freedom from abuse. These are not things that are meant in this legislation to be seen as discretionary kindness, but they're meant to be seen as a right. You have now afforded older persons rights with this legislation. That's the first thing. Secondly, it seeks to define what is seen as harming property. When you say harm, I just talked about harm. Somebody in a facility, you just leave them there, and the state takes over responsibility for them. 3 meals a day, all the medication, provide them with a lodging, housing, dormitory, provides them also with attention. I was quite happy yesterday when I saw the psychiatric hospital having a garden at the back of the female geriatric ward, where they now have lettuce, they have chives, and on mornings after breakfast, they take their elder patients outside to be able to have a little bit of outside time, to garden a little bit. And then when they went back inside, they were listening to the morning shows and playing Chuck Wagon Gang. And so they were quite pleased, but that's just the nurses. That's just the medical staff at the psychiatric hospital. Visiting hours could come and go every single day, and no one comes. The absence of care and attention really oftentimes is also a way of abusing our elders. So it doesn't confine this legislation, abuse, to broken bones and bruises. It defines physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse, but also neglect, abandonment, and financial exploitation. And what do we mean by financial exploitation? Until the system catches up with some people, they're comfortably home, drawing people's pension checks and taking advantage of their financial access to their accounts and their houses and all of these things, while these people are sitting in a facility without even a visitor for one day. No, that's not okay. But then there are also some other things that are deeper injuries suffered oftentimes by older persons. They don't make the news. They don't oftentimes get talked about in spaces like this, but they're slow, painful injuries. Things like coercion, fear, humiliation, isolation, manipulation, and the capturing, I mentioned just now, of a person's pension income, the erosion of property rights, taking up what you didn't put down, trying to reap where you did not sow, the withholding of medicine, the denial of voice, the condition of them being present in their space but powerless. This legislation attempts to treat to that. Third, it also speaks about passive tolerance moving now in the direction of active safeguarding. It requires people who see something to say something. Mandatory reporting, investigative powers, emergency protection, and enforceable sanctions. These are all measures that the state has outlined in this legislation. One of the tragedies that we have experienced and we've seen of elder abuse in many societies is that when harm occurs, or when abuse takes place, everybody knows something was wrong. Everybody knew something was not quite right there, but no one knows how to act. And then there's a code of silence where people say, I ain't getting in people's family affairs, I leaving that, I left that out. But in the meantime, an elder person in our community is present and feeling powerless. And we have to be able to make sure that we are protecting them with our own sense of personal responsibility. Fourth, and I mentioned this in my overview, we have the protection of care settings, and this is covered in Part 6 of the legislation. This is important in an aging society. Yesterday, in the psychiatric hospital, it's an amazing thing, Madam Deputy President, and you're a former Minister of Health, so you would know. I never knew that the psychiatric hospital was not just what I would see when I passed down Black Rock on the front road. I thought it was just those buildings in front of me. Who knew that that facility sits on 25, 27 acres of land? I figured that out only yesterday. 25, 27 acres of land, and has a bed count of around 500 persons, 500 beds on that facility. I didn't know. I saw it for the first time yesterday. And so when I saw those facilities, I also was able to see the individual wards. We have the male ward, geriatric, female geriatric. And one of the things that I was very awed by was the modern nature of the dormitories. And I'll start with the female ward. They said to me that that is their gold standard, and they're now working through how to make that the standard across the board on all of the wards. It was a brand new building. It had 2 large dormitories, well-appointed, air-conditioned. Then there was a large sitting area, a large modern kitchen area where they could do snacks and so on. They served meals, a large dining area, well appointed. I loved the fact that they had paintings on all of the walls of bright flowers. In that particular ward, it was a hibiscus, so that people felt as if they're in a space that is sunny and bright and homely. And they had the TV, they had the music, they had a garden outside, but it was a modern facility for our female elder persons in that location, and the same thing applied for our older, what we call geriatric patients in there as well. So care facilities need to have a standard. People need to feel, if I'm not home and I have to be in an institution for whatever the reason, at least it needs to feel homely. And this matters. And so this bill describes licensing of facilities now, inspection, monitoring and enforcement of standards for residential facilities, classification of the levels of care, mandatory training, the regulation of home-based care, a code of conduct, and a home services registration. So this is what is being done under this legislation in Part 10. Fifth, as I mentioned earlier, it sets out confidentiality to the patient and supports good faith reporting. Older persons are oftentimes not just vulnerable to abuse, but oftentimes to shame if your report was happening to them. I know of one case where I've heard someone say to me that they met an older person, they were in the house, and the older person would say, don't say nothing, he's get back. So then when you go along from here, he can get home how he feel like. Don't say nothing, don't make no deal about it. We've heard cases of older persons being in their homes and the person who takes care of them goes to work, puts them in a chair and puts them to face a wall for an entire day. We have heard all kinds of horror stories about what happens in homes with older persons, sometimes their own homes. And so reporting is critical. Family engagement is critical. Family remaining engaged over time, even though sometimes it can be hard, is critical. So this legislation allows now for not just for reporting, but protecting the privacy of the person who has reported. And so in this conversation, and because I mentioned psychiatric hospital, I did so on purpose, there was a conversation around whether mental health provisions ought to have been included in this piece of legislation. It was thought initially that this piece of omnibus legislation, which is what this is, should also include mental health. And I did say that there is an intersection where this bill collides with the health sector, even though it falls under the administration of the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, specifically the SEA. And the mental health components were felt that they needed to be done separately. I am happy to say that under the Ministry of Health, there is a brand new Mental Health Act, which is now in an advanced stage of preparation, and we expect that in due course, in the shortest possible time frame, that new piece of legislation, which will cover the mental health components that are relevant to this piece of legislation, will be brought to this place. And equally, the same thing applies to residential care, whether or not the administration of alternative residential care should remain under the Ministry of Health and Wellness, my ministry, or move under the ministry that covers elder affairs. There is clear authority in the legislation under the SEA, but the Ministry of Health maintains control and oversight over any facilities that have the responsibility. But it is shared governance with no room for elder persons to fall between the institutions. So the fifth issue that I want to highlight from the legislation is that of caregivers. In many instances, caregivers are not always fully trained. They don't always have the skills that are needed, and sometimes they're doing the best that they can, and sometimes it's not even just that. And so this legislation speaks about legislating standards of care, also strengthening the capacity of the persons who are providing that care on a day-to-day basis. So this bill covers that ground, and it is important. So we expect, obviously, that when facilities have to be brought up to code, that it will take some time. That's normal and expected, and that is something that we look forward to having persons take ultimate responsibility for. As I started, Madam Deputy President, by saying, I said the bill is essential, but it is not enough. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. I talked about it being the legal foundation for dignity and protection of older persons in their older age. But it alone, on its own, cannot answer the entire challenge that I started out by speaking about. It means that we have to be able to look again at the broader policy framework. And I started by mentioning the population policy. It tells us that we have to make some critical choices at this point in time. And that's where this government has gone. This government has taken the report of the Population Commission. It has taken the report of the persons with disabilities, because you have older persons with disabilities as well. It has taken the approach on mental health and mental wellness, because all of those things go together. And the government has taken this legislation as part of the whole of country approach to governance. It talks about end-of-life care, it talks about care standards, it talks about rights, it talks about safe facilities. It also talks in this space about workplaces and family policy that will allow for adults to combine work and care without collapse. And I say this in this context because oftentimes when we talk about mothers, especially single mothers and single parents, we brought another piece of legislation here called the Family Care Bill, the Family Life Protection Bill, which gave extended maternity leave and introduced paternity leave for the first time in this country. But the consideration also is that there are also family members who are working and balancing working with caring for older persons. And so the legislation considers that there needs to be a flexibility at the level of employers as well, who understand that. Yesterday I went to a workplace, and there was someone who was supposed to be there, and they weren't there because they worked flexi hours. And the flexi hours allowed for them to come in at 11 o'clock daily, not at 9 or 8:30, because they are responsible for taking care of an aging mother who has specific needs. And so before they come into the office on days, they take care of their aging mother, and then they hand over to another family member who takes over, and then they come in. Flexible hours, flexible working hours are also important in the workplace, because if the employer is not providing flexi hours and giving employees the space to care for their elderly in the way that I have just described, and with reason, while still managing their obligations to their employer, then you will have more and more and more persons being abandoned, and persons saying, we don't have the ability to take care of them. Across the entire system, we also need to be able to have productivity improvements so that smaller working age population, which is what we're having with the lower birth rate, is not asked to carry an ever larger social load without any kind of support. And that's where all of the other elements that we have already debated in this chamber are relevant. So the population bill is not separate from the older persons bill. The older persons bill is not separate from the population bill. It is one arm of it, and it represents Barbados' demography translated into a combination of rights, regulation, and care. I was able to find a couple of best practice examples, because we're not the only country in the world dealing with this. We're not the only country in the world dealing with an aging population. Japan, I found a few. Japan, I can see from in Japan that when a society grows older, they focus on building community care, institutional care, and employment pathways for older persons, whether or not fertility levels improve. They have adapted to their reality. In Singapore, I know my colleague likes to talk about Singapore a lot, they have been focusing on a whole of government, community-based, and properly funded aging policy. And that also is rooted in the case of Singapore, where it is often mandated because it's not the same democratic system as Barbados. You can tell people what to do and they will do it. In that instance, they have also rooted that in family relationships and what is required of each family to take care of their older members. In Portugal, they found a way to be able to supplement, from a population perspective, the diaspora moving back into their country, moving back home via migration, return migration, to replenish the labor force more quickly, and then also to be able to support their aging family members at home. In Canada, in Quebec specifically, they outlined child care and parental insurance that would support both early care for children and later care for members of their older community. And in Malta, they also had a similar model. And so all of these things are driven by policy combined with culture, policy combined with family, policy combined with individual responsibility, but most importantly, family, policy, and care working hand in hand. And so this legislation that we are debating today, and I hope that everyone can support, legislation can punish abuse. It can regulate facilities. It can create duties and responsibilities. It can empower inspectors, and it can compel reporting. But legislation on its own will not create care. Legislation on its own will not provide for our elderly. We must still take responsibility for teaching our families respect and care for our elderly. It must be taught, it must be reinforced, and it must be socially expected. That is why this bill and the wider national conversation that I have referred to is critical, and it addresses an issue which some describe as ageism, but in other instances it speaks simply to neglect and abuse and abandonment. This bill speaks about those things. And so, Mr. President, Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that this bill is read a second time. I beg to move that as we read this bill a second time, that we understand that there's a responsibility that rests on all of our shoulders, from those who earn the most to those that earn the least. Our elders are our elders, whatever our income bracket. Let the answer be clear for all of us. Let us focus on the rights of our elderly. Let us ensure that we enforce this bill in our homes and in our society. Most times, Madam Deputy President, when you ask people, do we want change? Everyone puts up their hand. Yes, we want change. But when you ask the same group of people who wants to change, very few will raise their hands. This bill applies to all of us who want change, because change begins with us. And this bill attempts to effect that change as a legislative framework. And with these few words, Madam President, Madam Deputy President, I am obliged to you, and I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator. The question is that the bill be now read a second time? Yes. Senator Goodridge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Good morning to the entire country, and good morning to all of the honorable senators here with me in this room today. It's always an honor and pleasure to be here, and I will continue to give glory to the Almighty God to be able to stand here and present to you on this Older Persons Care and Protection Bill of 2026. Now, I've listened to Minister Cummings, and I must answer and say that I am definitely one who would love change in society, and change that would, of course, help the vulnerable persons in this country, because we've heard the cry of many of the elderly persons, and we know that many of them have been abused and have been neglected many a time. And we have to, as people of the country, take a stand against the abuse and recognize that mechanisms must be put in place to protect them, because many of them are vulnerable and they can't protect themselves. So it is on us to, of course, look out for those persons in society. But today, I really want to give a critical analysis of the bill itself, because there are some concerns that I have. So while I do commend the efforts of the government, and I do think that is a very important piece of legislation, knowing what has been going on in the country, and that so many of the elderly persons, and I'm speaking to persons who are 65 years and older in accordance with the bill, have been left in places like the geriatric hospital, as Senator Minister Lisa Cummings alluded. And this bill, looking at its objects and its reasons, it has come at a crucial time where it is definitely necessary. But I have to give a critical analysis with looking at the sections of the bill, and I will list my concerns, okay? So firstly, I recognize that in section 2, in looking at the interpretation, Madam Deputy President, that abuse includes things that are likely to cause harm or distress. This seems now to be a very large net, and I'm not seeing the objective test explicitly stated in the piece of legislation. And that test, of course, is the reasonable man standard. And then in the interpretation section, a fit person means a person approved by the minister to care for older persons. Now, I have to ask, why is this power given to the minister? What qualifies a minister now to make that decision to determine who is a fit person there? And why not give the definition and the criteria of a fit person? And that is something that I want the government to recognize that is essential. When you're passing a piece of legislation, you have to be clear. And being clear would help us all to avoid any future issues. So that definition and criteria of a fit person should be one that everyone would know, rather than having it subjectively determined by a minister. So notice that the next interpretation is clearly defined, and that is for a healthcare provider. It means a medical practitioner, nurse, pharmacist, or paramedic. So if we can define that there, the healthcare provider, I don't see why then we can't have a definition there to be clear as to who a fit person is. Manager, as you can see there, in the piece of legislation, it means a person or organization approved by the minister to care for older persons. No, sorry, that actually is a troubling trend, because there you have manager means a person or organization, again, approved by the minister to care for older persons. Now, I'm not nitpicking, but here I recognize the trend is clear. You're giving the minister all this power to define, when it needs to be clear. It needs to be clear in the piece of legislation, Madam Deputy President. Older person, we see, means a person who is 65 years or above. I want to take you, Madam Deputy President, down to section 10 now. So today I'm just strictly really looking at the legislation. I know that we always say in Barbados that the public is not lawyers, but I think that if sometimes us lawyers take them through it very slowly, eloquently, and properly, they would understand what we are looking at. So section 10 there, it has that the $100,000 fine and or 5 years imprisonment. It also seems to be a troubling trend to criminalize inadvertent behavior based on what is there. Thereby, it makes everyone guilty. If the punishments are to become onerous, Madam Deputy President, then the crime must be explicitly defined with no room for misinterpretation, and that is an issue. You shouldn't be drafting pieces of legislation and saying, yes, we are going to pass a bill, when there is room for any misinterpretation. We really don't want to set that kind of precedence as a country, because we want that when legislation is being passed and the bill becomes an act, and we say yes to it, there's no room for this misinterpretation, causing then the judicial system to have to determine what was meant there in this piece of legislation. Section 11, ma'am. When you look at section A, it has R is likely to suffer abuse. Section 11F also has lives in or is exposed to circumstances which may cause physical, emotional, or mental harm to the older person. The net to being in need of care and protection appears large to capture many. So when you have the net so large and then it captures so many people, I have to really ask then, what are we trying to achieve when we make that point there in the piece of legislation there in section 11, A and F? I will go to another section because there are a number of concerns that I have as I read through it, and I made sure that I took the time to go through section after section. Because one of the criticisms on my campaign that I've been saying all the time is that this government has to carefully scrutinize legislation so that you do not have to double back. Make it right in the first place. Section 16, subsection 3 and 4. The manager is given 14 days to provide reasons opposing the minister's decision. However, to whom does the manager appeal? And that's a critical question. Who does the manager appeal? It is not stated. However, it may be the same minister who gave the first decision. If that is so, ma'am, then the appeal process is a farce. Section 21, ma'am, I hope I'm not going too fast for you. Subsection 2. After consideration of an application made pursuant to subsection 1, the minister may A, refuse to register the residential facility, B, register the residential facility subject to such conditions, ma'am, as he may determine, and direct that the applicant be issued a temporary certificate of registration stating the conditions, or C, register the residential facility. So again, ma'am, the minister here has a lot of power in determining whose facility here is registered. So all of that, Barbados, if my honorable senators don't want to hear my voice, all of that, Barbados, is determined by the minister. Right? And we're wondering, I'm wondering, Friends of Democracy is wondering, why is so much power given to this minister? Instead, the requirement should be explicit, very explicit, so that persons know whether they have attained them or not. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is good legislative drafting, to know whether you qualify or not. Section 21, subsection 10. Here, a social worker may determine who is a fit person. So again, we're leaving it to a social worker then to determine who is a fit person. Is that contradictory, ma'am? That is my question on the floor. Section 34, I would take Barbados to, subsection 4. Why should the distributor of a newspaper who does not know its contents be liable? Why is liability being rested there on the poor distributor? So if I'm distributing a paper, then I could be liable? That didn't make no sense to me in Bajan terms. It is honestly asking too much. It's asking the distributor to also have editor responsibilities, in my view. And that is my statement. Whether it's accepted or not.
Madam Deputy President, I was really trying not to.
The senator will have to yield.
I rise on a point of order. I was really trying not to. I believe I was very clear when I started out in my presentation. And I know that the Honourable Senator is new, and she may not have any experience in legislative drafting, but the minister, as is seen in this legislation, is identical to every other piece of legislation governing this country, including that which relates to the roads on which I know the Honourable Senator would have driven on to get here. The minister personally is not what is referred to in any piece of legislation, but it is the office of the minister. Secondly, Madam Deputy President, the honourable member is also misleading Barbados when the honourable member says that the Section 34 is speaking about putting undue responsibility on a publisher. A publisher, a media house in this country cannot publish anything that is known to fit the requirements under law of certain standards. They have to ensure it is compliant with the laws of the country. Otherwise, they can be sued, and not just whoever it is. I know there are members in this chamber who may be more equipped to speak on that than I would, but the honourable member is, in fact, on a few occasions so far, misleading the House, and I think it perhaps may be an indication not of malice of intent, but just lack of knowledge.
The Honourable Senator will be guided because I think that the points raised by the Leader of Government Business are legitimate. I would also wish I was not going to say anything, but since there has been an interruption, I really want to put on the record my concern that there has been no breach of the Honourable Senator's privilege. The Honourable Senator indicated that senators didn't want to hear her voice, and no one has interrupted the Honourable Senator. No one has made any adverse comment. There has been absolutely no breach of the Honourable Senator's privilege, and it really was unjust to so suggest in that offhand remark, because the public is not in a position to see or hear. They're only in a position to see or hear you. And the suggestion, therefore, was that senators were somehow stopping you or did not want to hear you. And I do not think that you have been fair to honourable members of the Senate to suggest that breach of privilege. The honourable senator will be guided for the duration of her speech.
Ma'am, I thank you for your sentiments. And of course, as I stand in this honorable Senate, is never at any time to offend any of the honorable senators who sit here. I was just referencing that because, of course, I can't read human mind. So I made my statement, ma'am.
Senator, I really I do not want to interrupt you, but I'm not going to let you put on the record things that suggest that your privilege is being breached or abused. If you cannot read people's minds, then say nothing, because you don't know what's in them. Make your speech without attacking other honorable senators.
Thank you, ma'am. I am guided by your wonderful statement. I thank you. And I will continue to critique the bill because I believe that it is essential. And I would say too, ma'am, that an attack could also be the statement that it is a lack of knowledge on my part, because that is a subjective view. For me, ma'am, as an attorney at law, I would defend my dignity and state that I am going through a piece of legislation. We are not before a judge or a jury, and I will give my opinion on the sections fairly in accordance with the knowledge that I have. Because many times attorneys will say one thing and the next attorney will say the other, and then a judge would make the final judgment. So I will continue, ma'am, and I thank you for your feedback. I thank you for your feedback. I thank you for the fact that you appreciate my presentation today.
The chair does not give feedback, honorable senator. The chair guides and directs, and therefore let me guide you now. Under the standing orders of this House, on this reading, the principles and broad content of the legislation and its intent and effect are discussed. When we go into committee, it is at that stage that one is permitted to do a detailed examination of the contents of the sections and the language and so on. Your speech, therefore, your comments up to this point are suited for the committee stage of the debate, and I'm therefore going to ask you to now comply with the standing orders, not only in not attacking other honorable senators, but certainly in confining yourself to a generic review and not a detailed analysis section by section, which is what is done in committee. That is not feedback, it is a direction.
Thank you, ma'am. I would love you to state, ma'am, the standing order of which you just referred to. Thank you.
Clerk, can you bring the standing, show the honorable senator the standing orders, please?
Ma'am, thank you. I will continue with my submission because my submission actually was not going to be long either way. I was just stating those sections because it's obviously in the interest of every Barbadian so that Barbados will know that when this bill is being passed, that we, the senators who are supposed to vote on the bill, we are comfortable with what we're saying yes to.
Honorable Senator, nobody is stopping you from giving Barbadians whatever information you think they need to have. But there are rules which govern the proceedings, and I am requiring you to comply with them.
Yes, ma'am. I am in compliance with what you have stated, and I thank you for that. Now, I want to also state that what I have said previously, I know that it is on record, and if I've offended Barbados, well, I do apologize. But I have to say, look, if we are saying that we care about the elderly, and we are passing a piece of legislation for the benefit of persons who are 65 years and up, then we have to ensure that any bill, Madam Deputy President, that we are passing is a piece of legislation that is properly drafted for us senators to accept. I would say clearly that never ever would I try to offend the honorable senators here, and I hope that they accept that apology. But this piece of legislation is an important piece, and my final statement before this honorable Senate is to ensure that when we look through those sections and we look at the interpretation of those sections, the legislation is properly defined and every section is clear so that we can avoid misinterpretation of this piece of legislation. And ma'am, Deputy President, that is my final statement on the bill. I thank you, this Honourable Senate.
So this is a relatively new session. There are several new members. Some of us need to learn the rules. I would wish to draw the attention of honourable senators to section 47 of your standing orders, which is at page 31. On the second reading of a bill, a debate may arise covering the general merits and principles. So it gives very clear guidance that at this stage, in a second reading, you're doing a generic debate. When you go then to page 32 at section 50, standing order 50, procedure in committee, 49 first. At this stage, you are not, 49.1, discussing the principle of the bill, but its details. And it is at that stage that you can go through section by section, making your critique on language, content of the legislation, and not the generic principles. As members who were here before would well be aware, there have been times when from this floor, in committee, legislation has been successfully challenged. So there is no attempt to silence anybody, merely to have the debate structured according to the requirements of the rules. I recommend to you, therefore, a reading, your personal reading of sections 47 through the end of section 50, if you have not yet read all of the standing orders. Please be guided, senators. Speakers? Senator Redmond.
Good morning, Madam Deputy President. It is with a profound sense of humility that I rise to make my maiden speech in this august chamber. It is a little later than those of others in similar position, but for reasons entirely beyond my control. First, I would like to thank the President of Barbados, His Excellency, the Most Honourable Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Bostick, for reposing such confidence in me by this appointment as an independent senator. I will certainly do all in my power to fulfill my responsibilities in that regard. I would also like to officially record my congratulations to the President of the Senate in his absence on his reappointment to that position, and equally to you, Madam Deputy, on yours. Madam President, in addressing the Older Persons Care and Protection Bill, I start by thanking the drafters for the simplicity of language and clarity of legal expression in the bill. Increasingly, we need to write law that is readily understood by the average citizen, that does not seek to intimidate or defy comprehension with legal jargon. The latter does not foster empowerment of our people in relation to their rights and responsibilities in the law. In contemplating this bill, it brought to mind a quotation from Nelson Mandela, and I quote, "A society that does not value its older people denies its roots and endangers its future." Herbert H. Humphrey, former Vice President of the United States, he stated, and I quote, The moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. Vice President Humphrey's statement places the responsibility to provision for and protect the youth, the elderly, and the vulnerable in the society in the hands of government as a moral responsibility, while Mandela's thoughts go beyond governmental responsibility and enjoin the wider society as a moral, cultural, and implicit economic necessity to value its elderly. In terms of a recognition of moral responsibility, we have certainly seen a slew of recent legislation seeking to address the needs of our youth and our vulnerable, including provisioning for and protecting all three categories of persons referenced by Humphrey. While there isn't a single consolidated Youth Protection Act, recent legislation and reforms have been aimed at protecting the young and have been evolving alongside broader social empowerment policies. Several recent measures directly strengthen the rights and welfare of children and young people, reflecting Barbados's commitment to child welfare, education, and family support, while aligning all these with international conventions, especially those related to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The socially vulnerable have had legislation aimed at improved social services, direct and varied forms of assistance to susceptible families, and channeling community empowerment through legislation and policy. The disabled have the Rights for Persons with Disabilities Act 2025. The elderly now have this bill for our active consideration, the Older Persons Care and Protection Bill. Let me state a vested interest in this bill and in the contents of the bill based on the definition of the elderly as I am defined as elderly in the bill myself. My bias is clear, but separate and apart from the excellent provisions that the bill provides. Of course, objectively, this legislation follows many other attempts by government to take care of the elderly through various pieces of legislation and institutionalized policy. Prior provisions through the Home Health Program, community elder care programs, the senior recreational activity programs, the National Conversation on Aging, and the list goes on. It is evident that government has recognized its responsibility, not least of all its moral responsibility, to take care of the elderly, and that this legislation in some ways pulls together various existing provisions while adding more specific ones to better establish a comprehensive legal framework to protect elders from abuse, neglect, and exploitation of various types. It also attempts to regulate residential and home care facilities, provide explicit rights for the elderly, and for the mandatory reporting of abuse, along with supervisory and emergency intervention mechanisms. Very importantly, the bill is aligned to international policies on aging and ageism, and in that regard should stand us in good stead. The legislation binds the state, and therefore government is legally obligated to adhere to the provisions, take the lead in this regard, and influence others to act accordingly to the benefit, to the all-round benefit of the elderly. The Social Empowerment Agency, which is to be an interministerial committee, as the lead body, should be able to strategically coordinate responsibilities across departments, across various agencies as the main administrative body, ensuring monitoring, implementation, and compliance with the legislation. Some of the provisions of the bill provide for prohibition of abuse of the elderly and categorizes and defines physical, sexual, emotional, and financial abuse, as well as including neglect and pain. In its further protection of the elderly, it is now mandatory to report suspected cases of abuse and allows the elderly to be removed and placed in designated places of safety by authorized persons. There is provision for a confidential register of abuse to be kept by the Social Empowerment Agency and official records of reported cases. What is novel too about this legislation is that it provides explicitly for persons in residential facilities to have rights, including participation in social, religious, cultural, and community activities, the right to privacy, and to keep personal possessions. All of these are rights that we take for granted on a daily basis. Residents can form committees to encourage a better daily quality of life through participation and representation. In terms of enforcement of the bill legislates clear guidelines to ensure compliance with the law. Its time-bound requirements of much of the mandated reporting is noteworthy, as are the heavy penalties associated with the violation of the provisions as outlined in the legislation. In summation, this bill strengthens legal protection of Barbados' aging population, a 65-plus-year-old group of people that currently stands at about a quarter of our population total, and in 50 years' time is expected to form more than 50% of the total population. It focuses on accountability for both institutional and home-based care providers. It addresses gaps in the reporting of abuse and enforcement of penalties that previously left seniors vulnerable. It promotes the rights, dignity, equality, fairness, and protection against various forms of discrimination to which our elderly are rightly entitled. I heard the question asked in the other place, but how did we get here? What has happened to us as a people, as a society, that we now have to legislate what was previously customary? Care for the elderly was previously seen as familial responsibility. Our collectivist Caribbean culture emphasized filial duty. Caring for parents and grandparents was seen as a moral obligation because they cared for you as children. Elders cared for us when we were young, and therefore we have the responsibility, and society owes them the responsibility for protection in return. Protecting and caring for the elderly rests on principles of dignity, reciprocity, and justice. Our elders were seen as bearers of wisdom, custodians of culture, and deserving of care because of their lifelong contributions. Why have our values and behaviors changed so drastically towards the elderly? Why are they so often not allowed to enjoy what they have worked hard for in previous times? Why is their inherent worth so often disregarded, along with their rights as human beings to care, protection, and dignity? Neglecting elders signals a breakdown of cultural values. Conversely, honoring them reinforces respect and gratitude across generations. Our present-day lifestyles place increasing pressures on families. There are pressures to succeed successfully, to succeed financially, and there is the rush to acquire materially. The need for big houses, the need for powerful SUVs can sometimes conflict with the time to take proper care of children, much less proper care of adults, especially older, perceived more difficult ones. There are those who readily dump, and we've heard that, elderly parents in residential homes. And there's the new term I learned, granny dumping, where persons are left at the hospital, abandoned by their families. Because, of course, they are an inconvenience. There are increasingly too few traditional, moral, ethical, or cultural norms to influence and regulate our behaviors. Our society has in too many instances become all about self. But it is also true, too, that many struggle with the best of intentions to juggle their competing responsibilities of work and family life while taking care of the elderly, who generally are living longer, and because that is happening, they are more susceptible to diseases that are associated with the elderly, especially forms of dementia. That makes their home care more difficult and burdensome. So both sides of the coin exist. Smaller family size too, with the reduction of the extended family, limits the resources within a family to help provide care for the elderly. How do we solve these problems that will only increase with time, given the reality of our population profile? The answers may not be definitive, but certainly this legislation that government is seeking to pass positions it to lead to address one set of problems within a given context. There are others that need attention. The general attitude of many persons in the society towards the elderly needs attention. Hopefully, this legislation can assist in changing some values and attitudes, especially of some persons hired to take care of the elderly. Government as hirer of persons to provide elderly care must engage in more careful hiring practices. And these must be coupled with appropriate training and sensitization, not only in the technical aspects of caregiving, but also in the roles, responsibilities, and penalties of this piece of legislation. Opportunities for healthy, capable leaders to opportunities for healthy, capable elders to input into, inform, and participate in elderly care training must be provided. The elderly know best what they need as persons on the receiving end of care. Involve them. The value that we place in them as individuals can be demonstrated in circumstances such as these. Intergenerational exposure and harmony can demonstrate value for the elderly and combat their loneliness, while in turn offering comfort, guidance, and caring to youth. It can reinforce bonds between generations and engender compassion and responsibility. As faculty advisor for the Key Club, I used to take students to a nearby old people's home, and they were able to interact with the elderly, to recognize them for the fonts of knowledge, wisdom, culture, tradition that they are. In the same vein, and wearing a different hat, I have suggested that retired persons who are fit can assist as classroom aides at nursery and primary level. They can be used as substitute teachers and resource persons in classes studying civics, social studies, local culture and customs. Their life experience can help guide at-risk youth, and fulfill some roles of absent parents and grandparents. The wisdom, experience, and legacy of the elderly need to be valued and appreciated and used to help in the socialization of the youth. Elders often serve as mediators, storytellers, and spiritual anchors, promoting community cohesion. Protecting them strengthens cultural continuity and social stability. How do we, unwittingly or otherwise, exclude our own elderly in our daily lives? Where is the quality time that they need given to them? To what extent do we allow ourselves to be overtaken by social media, for example, instead of communicating with those that need our company and attention? To what extent do we exclude them by not taking the time to teach them the use of gadgets and technology? Some who are taught become quite proficient, and it opens new worlds to them, but they need that time to be taught. In concluding this presentation, I should like to look at some limitations of the proposed legislation as identified by my research, and perhaps some of the lawyers can challenge this in other sessions. The resource dependence. The Social Empowerment Agency and inspectors will definitely need the adequate funding and resources to fulfill their mandate. If this is not done, then the enforcement powers will remain entirely theoretical. Strong focus on regulation for residential facilities must exist, and are provision for in the law, but less structured oversight of informal family-based care needs greater attention. Abuse in private homes, where the majority of elders actually reside, may be harder to detect. Mandatory reporting challenges exist, and this may lead to underreporting if citizens fear retaliation, stigma, or lack of confidence in authorities' response. The bill does not comprehensively address poverty, housing insecurity, or access to health care, which are major vulnerabilities for seniors. While the interministerial structure of the agency may help in addressing this necessary connectedness, there are no guarantees in that regard. The potential overlap with other laws may cause judicial confusion with the Domestic Violence Protection Order. This is flagged as a problem even though the legislation claims otherwise. There's a heavy burden on law enforcement as social workers without clear operational protocols on how both should operate. This can lead to the risk of uneven application or even infringement of rights. The Act mandates compliance but does not require public education campaigns or caregiver training, which are vital for prevention. So recommendations therefore include sufficient funding and staffing for Social Empowerment Agency and inspectors, expanded oversight to informal family-based care settings, develop public education campaigns to reduce stigma, promote value of and respect for the elderly and encourage reporting, integrate socioeconomic supports like housing, health care, retrofitting of homes into elder protection policy, clarify coordination mechanisms with existing laws to avoid jurisdictional overlap, and mandate caregiver training, very importantly, and awareness programs to strengthen prevention. In conclusion, the case for elder care is neither a purely legal or policy-based one only. Other considerations engaging moral, ethical, and cultural contemplations factor very importantly into the equation. There is a vital role for the legacy, value, and cultural continuity of the contributions of the elderly. Let us make room for and use of them. We have already been experiencing the results in our youth of what Mandela warned, of not valuing our elderly, knowing our roots, and therefore endangering our future. This Older Persons Care and Protection Bill stands head and shoulders above others in Trinidad, Antigua, and Barbuda, both in scope and enforcement. It is progressive legislation that places government upfront in the care, protection, and worth of our elderly. The necessary resources must be provided to ensure its success and effectiveness. I give my full support to this bill. Madam Deputy President, I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator. Speakers? Senator John King.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today with a deep conviction to commend to this House the Older Persons Care and Protection Bill 2026. You know, I listened very carefully as the previous senator spoke about where she is at as it relates to age. In 4 days' time, I'm going to be 62 years of age, which means that I'm actually getting very close to being considered elderly. And I just want to say this to the younger persons that we have in the house with us today. It seemed as if a few years ago, I was traveling either on airplanes or on cruise ships and entertaining people all over the world without a care, without a thought of aging. I felt I was going to be young, always. Boy, was I wrong. The mere fact that we are passing legislation, I want you to think about what I'm saying now. The mere fact that we have to pass legislation to ensure that persons in caregiving institutions, that persons within their homes have to follow these particular guidelines to do that which as human beings should be automatic. The care of persons on whose backs we have established the lives that we live today. Members of the Senate, this should be a serious concern to every single one of us in this room and outside of it. I have watched, and I know most of you have seen it, in the newspapers, on social media, or just in conversation. Elderly persons, woman in St. John, raped. An elderly man walking on Belmont, robbed in broad daylight and beaten. The stories of persons not just living in Barbados, but those of Barbadian descent or born in Barbados but lived abroad, sending home monies to build properties for them to retire, and by the time they get back to Barbados, there's nothing to be found. And you ask the question, how did we get here? It is a simple breakdown in values, an erosion of the simple idea that the village had value and that the elderly persons within the village had value and commanded, not demanded, but commanded respect of everyone living within the same village with them. This legislation seeks to remedy some of the problems that we are having. But legislation, regardless of how well it is written, or regardless of how much penalties that it has, it cannot and will never be able to change behavior when the behavior becomes almost normalized. I want you to think about it. There's legislation all over the world for many, many years. We've seen it from way back in days, the Inquisition and all these things. People do the most horrendous things to other people to get them to stop doing certain things, and they still continue to do it. So it means that there has to be, as was mentioned earlier, an educational aspect that goes along with the legislation. And it has to start in the primary schools. We have to begin the conversation with our young children as to what it means to age, as to what it means to engage with older persons. Because if we don't do that, what you're going to find happening over and over again is that people will say, oh, but these fines are excessive, and you're trying to get people money out of their pockets for this and that, not understanding or paying close attention to what we are doing as a society. I'll give you a simple analogy, I guess the word I would want to use. You would hear me mention that I used to work on cruise ships then and sing. And I remember once having a conversation with an older lady on the ship. I just finished doing a Sam Cooke medley or something like that. And she said to me, you know, young man, so what do people in your country, you know, do, like with elderly people? And I was like, okay, so I live in Barbados. And she said, next thing was, what do you call you people? Well, are you barbarians? And at the time I laughed, right? I thought about it and I laughed. And I said, no, it's not barbarians, it's barbarians. That's how we refer to ourselves. But it struck me when I was sitting here and listening to the various contributions that, in a sense, unwittingly, she may have been right. She may very well have been right. Because the kinds of behaviors that are being exhibited in this country at this time, especially as it relates to our older persons, can we safely say that we are Barbadians or are we barbarians? Because we've fallen to a level of behavior that borders on the term barbarism. And I'm very, very, very concerned that while we might be in here and we will argue politically, left, right, and center, as to if this is good or if this is bad, my major concern is that I wish I lived in a society that I didn't have to do this at all. And I say it again, I wish I lived in a society that I would not have to come into a Senate to debate this bill at all. It is concerning. And I don't want any of us in here to leave today thinking that this is just, another layer of legislation. This is serious. If you now have to put things in place where persons going into caregiving institutions have to be worried about the kind of care that they're going to get. They have to be worried about the people who you employ. And oftentimes, I hear this term all the time, We need to train, and we need to train, and we need to train. I know we need to train. But I've said this before in a different place, in a different time, not just concerning this particular bill, but in a lot of other areas. Some of the most well-trained persons, you can't see inside their brains. You can't. And people can show you with the qualification everything that you want to see in the qualification. But behind that brain, you have an antisocial personality who wants to be in an institution such as this to run havoc. How do you separate and find out who is who apart from qualifications? And those are the things that we have to seriously begin to look at. And I speak about these things now because it hit me hard as I sat here listening. As I told you, 4 more days, I'll be 62. If God willing, 10 years' time, I'll be 72. And I may very well find myself at home. I know you'll come and look for me, Ryan. I appreciate it. I know I can count on you to come and look for me. But I'm trying to get you to think seriously that you ain't gonna be young all the time. And that it is important that these conversations that we have, and I want us to be serious about it, these conversations that we have ramifications for people that we are looking at now, these young ladies sitting down with us and young gentlemen. That what we do today is going to impact on the quality of life that they have going forward. And so, if there's any persons inside this chamber or outside of it who should really be the best advocates, apart from the senators, in getting people to think about what this legislation seeks to do and why it is important, why it is necessary, and what are the problems that we've been facing that causes us to have to do this, is our younger people. Is our younger people. You need to be the ones who really get out there on the floor and speak to your colleagues and to your friends and even to yourselves. As to take a good look in the mirror and ask yourself, do I treat my grandmother or my aunts and uncles who are older than me or who fidgeting with the device and can't get handled as good as quickly as I do, I get frustrated? I see you want your lady laughing because you know what I'm saying is true. Do you get frustrated with it? Do you see them then as a burden? Because once you begin to see them as a burden, everything shifts. The approach to them shifts. Or do you see them as being miserable? These are the things that the legislation can't touch. But these are the things that you have to think about. And then there's another side, which oftentimes gets thrown under the carpet when we are dealing with these things. It is increasingly more difficult for those of us who still have busy lifestyles, managing work, managing all of these things, and then at the end of the day or whatever, you have an elderly person who is dealing with dementia, Parkinson's disease, any of the mental type of disabilities, if I could use that word. And you know, not being trained in these areas, you have to learn how to deal with it. It becomes even more stressful for you as the caregiver in the home, managing all of these things. But these are not things that we are taught in school. These are not things that we have a lot of conversations about or whatever. And so, as was mentioned earlier, there are a number of things that we need to do as this legislation comes into play. so that those persons who are suffering with that, the caregivers within the home, having to deal with persons who can't recognize them, or people who might get up and walk out of the house and go somewhere, they got to be looking around. We got to take these things also into consideration, because I would here to think that at some point in time, I don't know how human behavior is. This body here live next door to you that don't like you too much, so they see an older person walking, going down the road, and they say it happened twice, they say it happened 3 times, and then they pick up the phone and call somebody and say, abuse going on today, your body walking, going down the road every morning. Not understanding what is the dynamics within the home at the same time as to what the caregiver themselves are dealing with. And so I don't want to belabor the point, but I want us as Barbadians, not barbarians, but as Barbadians, to begin to think about how we treat to each other now, not just when we get old, but if we start dealing with each other in a completely different way now, it wouldn't matter what age you are at, because then you would understand that you have a responsibility to another human being in front of you, a member of your community. And as was mentioned, our older persons, they didn't only just work in the fields and give us the opportunity to enjoy a different standard of life through their blood, sweat, and tears. They are also reservoirs of memory. You know, simple conversation with sometimes with older persons, you learn so much you wouldn't believe it. And so as we go through the legislation and the things that we try to prevent, the measures that are put in, fines and the training and all the other things that are going for the persons within the institutions and whatever. For me, the main thing is going to be in the homes. How we treat to each other and how we view things from outside. Because a lot of this that we are facing today, at one stage in Barbados would have been unheard of. But I've always talked about this simple word, access. Access is good, and it can also be bad. Because sometimes when you see things what's happening in other places and other things, people use the excuse, well, it isn't bad in Barbados because it's more rampant in someplace else. Forgetting that we don't live in the someplace else. We live here. And it is important for us to stop comparing, especially when we are not at the top of our game, comparing it to other places and say, but look, don't look inside. Don't talk too much about what happened in Barbados. Look and see what's happening in another place. And we ain't as bad as that. That's not an excuse. And it will never be an excuse. Every single one of us has the responsibility to improve ourselves, to ensure how we interact with elderly persons is in a respectful, is in a caring, and in another sense, in a grateful manner. You know, I'll give you a simple story. In my early days of Calypso, I never forget it. I think it would have been around the very first time they did Party Monarch at East Coast. I remember getting into an argument with a young Calypsonian because of this same kind of behavior. He was ranting and carrying on, man. I can get rid of them, this, the body. And I said, hold on, boss. Just hold on. See them fellas there? All of them. No names called. You see all of them? Had not for them, we can be down here doing what we're doing here today, right? And getting paid for it. and enjoying the chance to travel all about, do all the things that we were doing. And I saw this coming from back then. That was 1995, I believe. I saw this coming. And I never thought that I would be in the Senate today having to debate this same thing. Trying to get people to behave in a way which should be common to a human being. To have respect for their elders. I want us to really, 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 when we leave here this evening, or whatever time we leave, to really begin to think about how you feel. How do you feel? I'm going to ask this question. How do you feel that we have to come into Parliament to create to pass and create to create and pass legislation that asks you to be human? Because that's what it is. At the core of it, that's what we're talking about. To be human. I finished my rant. Because I'm really upset about it. I am. But I commend the government on doing what is right, in saying to Barbadians and to the rest of the world that we actually do care about this problem, and that we are taking measures to ensure that best practices as practiced around the world, that we are part and parcel of that, and that we have respect for our elders, that we are going to ensure that in their twilight years, that life is enjoyable, that is not a living hell, and that those persons who will be perpetrators of any sort of abuse to them or against them will be held accountable. But on that point, I want to say this here too, before I sit down. And like the former senator who said she didn't want to offend anybody. Yeah. Former speaker before me. Right? Boy, you never know. I want to say this. I want to say this also. There's some things that we sweep underneath the carpet. And oftentimes when we have these discussions, we talk a lot about, people who go and actually write checks from, older people and do all these things. But there's something that's happening in Barbados. A lot of men, and they talking men now, don't want to talk about, but you talk about it here today. We a lot of old men are being robbed left, right, and center, morning, noon, and night. Not by other men. Not by other men. Not by other men. And that's the point. And the interesting thing about it is that when these things happen, I don't have to say what it is, because everybody knows, but when it happens, it's a joke. It is a huge joke. People laugh and say, oh Lord, this poor fella, and whatever, but nobody tags it as abuse. Nobody tags it as abuse. It is a joke. And you can look around here and see everybody laughing. It is a joke. But the truth is, it is abuse. Well, I be dealing with the elderly now. Young fellas who find themselves in that situation. I met Randy, sorry for you. Sorry, my brother. But, Senator, I'm sorry. But I'm more concerned, seriously, about these things happening to older men in the society. And I just want you to understand that if we can take seriously this, when it happens in another instance, we have to pay the same attention to it when it's happening to older men who may be seeking love, who may be looking for companionship. God knows what they're looking for. But it is happening, and it is not a joke. It is not a joke. And with those few words, I will also say, thank you, Lord, it ain't happening to me. I'm a blessed you.
Senator Slocum.
Madam,
We will all pray for Senator King.
Madam Deputy President, thank you first for acknowledging me and the opportunity this afternoon to contribute to this Older Persons Care and Protection Bill 2026. Let me first start by saying that the world as we know it is changing very fast. We can't ignore it, Madam President. The truth is, some things are now the past. Senator King asks, how did we get here? But this bill demands of us to ask the question, where do we go from here? Madam Deputy President, this bill tugs at the heartstrings for mine in particular for a few reasons. When I contemplate my own circumstances, I often have noted and said to many that I was raised by my grandmother. And by virtue of this bill, this legislation, she is classified as an older person. She is, and I'm not telling out her age because you never tell out a lady's age, but with his, she is approaching that of 80. And I'm fortunate to still have my great-grandmother with me, who is approaching 100 years. And she's at 98 years to be specific, Madam President. And I am hopeful that God will grant her the strength to actually reach the age of 100. And therefore, Madam President, to my mind, we all have some form of interaction with all the persons in our society. And therefore, this piece of legislation demands what I consider to be national engagement, national dialogue, and maybe even, if we'll see the result of this afternoon's vote on it, bipartisan endorsement. I say this for several reasons, however, Madam President. When we look at our society today, as I stated in the outset, and as Senator King alluded to, our country is changing rapidly. Our nation was built on the premise of pride and industry. Our nation was built on the premise of respect for each other, respect for man, woman, boy, girl, young, and the old. But somewhere along the line, Madam President, it seems as if we've forgotten some of the values that guided this country. I say so for several reasons, some of which Senator Cummins alluded to earlier. We recognize a change in behavior where young people seem not to be understanding or caring for older persons, whether they go on the bus. One time you would stand up when you see an older person, even just a woman getting in the bus, and as a young man, you will see that person come in and you stand up and allow them to sit. When you're in the lines or queue at a restaurant or a cash point or something, you would allow an older person to go in front of you because that was the thing of the past. That is the thing that you're accustomed to. But, Madam President, there seems to be a change in attitude in this country. One that begs not just for this legislation to be taken into consideration, but the culture of this country. And the truth is, I celebrate and support this legislation. But I'm much more concerned about what is happening on a broader level in our country. Elambe Montley, in his book, Better Must Come, Volume 6, Madam President, I believe it's Volume 6, spoke about the fact that you cannot legislate culture. And it's difficult to legislate culture. Culture in itself lives and breathes not on statute books, it doesn't breathe in bills and acts. It is the way in which we interact with each other, the way how a society is built. And therefore, we must contemplate, why do we have to bring this legislation? Because while we may very well vote on this today and do so in a way with our conscience and we vote with conviction, there's a broader societal challenge before us. That is how we treat each other. So I ask the question again, where do we go from here? Madam President, and maybe to your recollection in my maiden speech, that I presented three questions or three areas of which I will always articulate or view legislation, the lens of which I will view it. Clarity of thought, sense of purpose, expected outcomes. And I have not deviated from that principle. Madam President, this legislation, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, check the boxes rather, and solves a critical challenge in our society. There is, however, at the policy level, a few things when delivering this legislation, if it is passed, that I think government must also take into consideration. And it is my hope that Hansard will also lead future governments to also reflect on the discussion surrounding this critical piece of legislation. Now, first off, Madam President, Deputy President, there's a point that Senator Goodridge was making earlier that I do not share in whole, but I do have some consideration in part for. I believe that to some extent this legislation can be overly bureaucratic. I'll tell you why. I'm not going to go down into the granulars, I promise you that. But if you take reference to page 26, I believe, and you look at, for instance, the establishment of residence committees for residential facilities, if I look at it on face value, I'm quite in agreement with it. But I've said before that not only here in Barbados, but across the Caribbean, we have an implementation deficit. This is but one consideration for the challenges I can see potentially coming with this legislation. And it's not to suggest that it shouldn't exist, but it's one that I want to bring to the attention of this chamber and that of the government as just part of what government must pay very close attention to in the implementation of this legislation. It says, Madam President, it speaks about establishing a residents committee with representatives of the residents, a representative of the agency, which is the SEA in this instance, include a member of the public. Madam President, I don't want to pour cold water over it, but the implementation deficit that we have, in not just Barbados, but in the region, and being under-resourced as a country, and sometimes not having the structures to be able to support proper implementation, this is one area that I am concerned about. I also want to add to a point that, the earlier point of being overly bureaucratic, that yes, I acknowledge the comment, the aside from then the leader of opposition, government business rather, is Senator Cummins, that when we see minister in legislation, it often refers to that of the office. But in truth, we have seen a habitual practice in governments around the region, in the Commonwealth Society, that there's a very much more hands-on role governments, ministers of government play in not just the oversight, but the implementation of legislation and the approval processes, etc. And therefore, I also want to caution that when this legislation is implemented, it doesn't necessarily mean, or it doesn't invite the over-reliance on a government minister to actually be the individual, literally processing applications for residencies, etc. There's another aspect of which I asked this Senate to contemplate, and that is of the broader national aging policy that government presented in 2023 to 2028. To my mind, it is a brilliant piece of policy, one that ought to be celebrated, but we must ensure at all times that there is an alignment with policy that comes before legislation and policy that comes after legislation. Now, policy is an overarching framework, and yes, I understand of which is carried out through which legislation is formed. But I recognize that that piece of policy is dated up to 2028. But I want to see an effort from early, Madam President, to ensure that there is a continuation of a policy framework coming out of this legislation. Because yes, this doesn't get into the granular aspects. It doesn't state X, Y, and Z in all instances, because legislation is not designed in such a way to go into the nitty-gritties. But it means if this legislation is to be effective, governments, not just this present government, but successive governments from here on, must also ensure that the policy aligns with what the legislation is also seeking to address. Madam Deputy President, the great philosopher and that of Plato suggested that justice gives each person its due. I am equally in agreement with Plato, because I believe, as he suggested then, that the dignity in which older persons must live in this country must be held in high regard. On the policy level, Madam Deputy President, I also want to draw the attention to the need for ensuring that structures in residential facilities exist, especially those which are privately owned. To some extent, the legislation speaks to this. I know that Senator Walcott would be quite familiar that in 2007, I believe you served as Minister of Health then, the government of the day would have repealed the Nurses and Midwives Act to introduce the Nurses Act. It was one of the last efforts of the government led under Prime Minister Arthur at the time. And I believe there, at the policy level, it speaks to how, not at the level of the Act, but it brought the Act up to the Nurses Act then up to date. But what it didn't look at, and I believe healthcare in general needs to look at, is how we deploy nurses into residential facilities. And I'll tell you why. I believe that this legislation, while it speaks to standards, I am concerned at a policy level that when it is implemented, that we don't have the necessary support at the residential facilities to ensure that the standard of care is at a certain level. What do I mean by that? We know that there are 3 categories of nurses, for example, registered with the Nursing Council of Barbados. We know that they're registered general nurses, we know that they're nursing assistants, and then they're nursing auxiliaries, which is one that came at a later stage. Nursing assistants practice that of go through a year program, nursing auxiliaries a 6 months program. I believe beyond the care of the elderly courses that happen, that we need to ensure that we upscale those even in private residential facilities to ensure that the quality of care that we require for our senior citizens, our older persons, that they can receive it at the level of even the private residential homes. Now, there's also a challenge when it comes to those who are cared for in their private homes. Madam President, Deputy President, I think there's a need to recognize the challenges that Barbadians face in being able to care for their loved ones equally. Yes, this older person's bill speaks about care and protection, but sometimes there are genuine challenges in being able to offer the care that is required for some of our senior citizens. I know, for example, ma'am, that the cost of even stuff like diapers and you know, mattresses in which persons have to use, even stuff like those mattresses required to prevent, you know, pressure sores, bed sores, they're rather expensive. And I know that government has made some facilitation in some regards over the years, but I believe that we can do a greater job to be able to assist with those. Ma'am, you know, in some instances, families who cannot even afford have to be paying, you know, thousands of dollars when the month comes to be able to support their loved ones. And while people may want to ensure that they can keep their loved ones in their homes and be able to support them for a period of time, the truth is it is difficult to do so without the resources required. So, as much as I am of the consideration, there are a group of individuals, not the majority, but there are a group of individuals out there who willfully treat the senior citizens in a way of which they're less deserving. There are those who want to treat to their loved ones in a way of which they're desirous, in which they want to ensure that they get quality care, but it's just difficult to do such. And I want to just reinforce, Madam Deputy President, that it's important for government at a policy level to now look and see how we can support those who live in their own residences and who are cared by loved ones, but they need a level of support. The truth is, government is not going to be able to put everyone in a residential, a private, a public residential facility. Not everybody can stay at a geriatric hospital. Government cannot subsidize, in the truest sense, those who own private residential facilities, of which individuals have to be paid to go into those facilities. But there's a greater consideration. Greater consideration needs to be made for those who have to look after their loved ones, and even go to the extent of even to bring in private nursing care. That in itself is also very expensive. So I think that at a policy level, this is something that needs to be contemplated. Madam, I also want to give consideration to a point of government-owned residential facilities. And the truth is, in 2015, the World Health Organization, through its studies and the index of which Barbados fell then, 100 older or older persons to those in the category of under 15, we had surpassed the global index. By way of admission through Senator Cummins earlier, in the last census, we recognize that there also are older persons who experience the number of older persons have now increased significantly. I want for us as a country to start looking at the silver economy. It is something that Senator Redmond spoke to in brief earlier, and it's something that also needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to older persons in our society. I believe, in truth, there's a need for us to even look at the Give Back program that exists with the University of the West Indies, and even that of younger students at Barbados Community College and at the SJPI in their Give Back efforts. I believe it's also important for them to start going into some of the older residential homes, etc., because loneliness is also a thing that exists in our society. So, Madam Deputy President, I am in full support of this bill, but I just want to implore government once again, at the level of implementation and at the policy level, you must take a serious look at how you address the implementation of this legislation. It is a good piece of legislation, but it can only be as good as how you implement it. It can be only as good as the policy framework that serves around it. And I also want to just bring to the attention that that national aging policy expires in 2028, and there's a need for us to once again ensure that there's a continuation of that, and that we do not allow it to expire without actually going back to the drawing board and looking at where the deficits were, where the challenges came in the previous instance, and how we can move forward supporting our older persons in society. With that, Madam President, Deputy President, I'm much obliged.
Senator Walker.
Madam President, I beg to move that this sitting be suspended for 1 hour until 2:30 for lunch. Thank you.
The question is that the session be suspended for 1 hour until 2:30 this afternoon. All honourable senators in favour, would you please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it. The session is now suspended.